Imagine you are 11 years old. You have just been married to a man more than 2 decades your senior in a ceremony you did not attend, to a duchy you did not choose, in a city you have never seen. The marriage took place by proxy in Brussels, a legal formality conducted through representatives, while you remained in the Netherlands with your aunt, far from the husband who is now by the laws of Christendom, your lord and master. You do not yet speak his language fluently. You have never met him in person. You probably know what marriage means in the 16th century, because girls of 11 in that world are taught to understand these things early. That consummation will be expected, that children must follow, that your body and your future belong to someone else now, and that resistance is not a concept available to you. And then, less than 5 years later, a far more powerful king will want you, and you will say no, not because the world suddenly becomes kinder to women who refuse, not because you discover some new reservoir of courage, but because by the time Henry VIII of England comes looking, you will have learned something that his other wives never got the chance to learn. That the line between survival and surrender is one a woman can choose to hold if she has the right people standing beside her. This is not a fairy tale. This happened. Her name was Christina of Denmark. And what she did, or more precisely, what she refused to do, is one of the most remarkable acts of quiet, calculated resistance in the entire history of women who had no legal right to resist anything at all. Christina was born in Nyborg, Denmark, in November 1521. She was the younger of 2 surviving daughters of King Christian II of Denmark and Norway, and his wife, Isabella of Austria, who was the sister of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. That Habsburg connection placed Christina at the very center of the web of power that bound 16th century Europe together. A web of royal marriages, military alliances, religious conflict, and dynastic ambition that treated kingdoms as property and women as the currency used to buy them. Her father did not last long on his throne. In January 1523, when Christina was barely a year old, the Danish nobility rose against Christian II and offered the crown to his uncle, Duke Frederick of Holstein. The king, his wife, and their 3 children, Dorothy, Christina, and their young brother John, fled into exile in the Netherlands, settling in Veer, in Zeeland, where they came under the protection of Margaret of Austria, the regent of the Netherlands, and their maternal great-aunt. The exile was not temporary. Christian II would spend the rest of his life attempting to reclaim his crown, moving between European courts, making failed alliances, and exhausting the patience of every ruler who sheltered him. In 1532, when Christina was 10 years old, one of his attempts to retake Denmark ended in catastrophe. He was captured by his uncle, now King Frederick I, and imprisoned. He would remain a prisoner for the rest of his life, dying in captivity in 1559. A king who became a cautionary tale about the cost of political miscalculation. That same terrible year of 1532, Christina's brother John, her only brother, just 14 years old, died of a fever while traveling with the emperor. The loss of John meant that Christina and her older sister Dorothea became the sole surviving heirs to their father's claim to the Danish throne. It also made them, in the cold arithmetic of dynastic politics, even more valuable as marriage pawns than they already were. Their mother, Isabella of Austria, had not survived to see any of this. She had died in 1526 in Ghent, when Christina was only 4 or 5 years old, worn down by the strains of exile and grief. By the time Christina was old enough to understand her situation, she had already lost her country, her father, her brother, and her mother. What she had instead was her aunt. Margaret of Austria died in 1530, but before she did, she oversaw the early education of Christina and her siblings in the Netherlands. Margaret was herself one of the most capable women of the era, a twice-widowed regent who governed the Low Countries with formidable skill and had educated an entire generation of remarkable women at her court. Among the young noblewomen who passed through Margaret's household in the years just before Christina arrived was notably a young English girl named Anne Boleyn, who spent time there in 1513. After Margaret's death, her role as regent of the Netherlands passed to Mary of Hungary, Christina's maternal aunt, the sister of both Christina's mother Isabella and the Emperor Charles V. Mary was a widow herself, her young husband having died in battle in 1526. She had chosen not to remarry. Instead, she had chosen power, real, administrative, executive power, and she exercised it with a clarity and effectiveness that made her indispensable to her brother the Emperor. Under Mary's governance, the Netherlands became one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe. Mary was a woman who read widely, collected art, made policy decisions, managed the complicated relationship between Spain and the Low Countries, and kept Charles V's northern territories stable during decades of war and religious upheaval. She was not a queen consort managing a household. She was a ruler managing a state. Christina grew up watching this. She grew up in Mary's household, absorbing the rhythms of real governance, how to manage advisors, how to negotiate between competing interests, how to hold authority without making unnecessary enemies, how to delay what could not be stopped and prevent what could be prevented. She learned languages: Dutch, Flemish, Spanish, Italian, German, French, English. She learned statecraft. She learned, most importantly, that a woman's value was not only measured in whom she married, and that there were other ways to exercise power than through a husband. She was described by contemporaries as tall, dark-eyed, beautiful, intelligent, and lively. She loved hunting and riding. She had her mother's Habsburg composure and something else. Besides, a quality that is harder to name, a kind of watchful self-possession, as though she were always observing and cataloging the world around her. She would need all of it. In 1531, Christina's uncle, the Emperor Charles V, agreed to a match between his 12-year-old niece and Francesco II Sforza, the Duke of Milan. Francesco was considerably older than his bride. Born in 1495, he was in his mid-30s, more than 2 decades Christina's senior. He was also chronically ill, never having fully recovered from a suspected poisoning that had left him weakened and unable to walk without a cane. His hair had turned gray early. He walked with a stick. None of this disqualified him in the eyes of the emperor. Milan was strategically vital, and Sforza needed an heir. Christina was available. Mary of Hungary was horrified. She wrote to her brother Charles in unusually direct terms, pointing out that Christina was not old enough for this, being only 11 and a half, and that marrying her at such an age would be contrary to the laws of God and reason. Charles was unmoved. He wrote back that he feared Francesco's age and ill health would prove a greater obstacle to producing children than Christina's youth. But Mary was determined to delay the consummation as long as possible, and she succeeded, at least in part. The proxy wedding took place on September 23, 1533, in Brussels. Christina was 11, almost 12. Francesco was in Milan. Ambassadors exchanged vows on behalf of the couple, and Christina became, in legal terms, Duchess of Milan, without having left the Netherlands, without having met her husband, without any ceremony she actually witnessed. Mary delayed her departure for as long as she could, citing winter weather and other inconveniences. Finally, on March 11, 1534, Christina set out for Milan in a black velvet litter drawn by 4 horses. She was 12 years old. Francesco rode ahead to intercept her party before her formal arrival, and by all accounts, showed her every courtesy and kindness. On May 3, 1534, Christina made her official entry into Milan, wearing a gown of white brocade and a long veil, riding a white horse, and was acclaimed by the crowds that lined the streets. A chronicler recorded her as a vision more divine than human. The following day, the in-person wedding ceremony was celebrated in the Rocchetta Hall. Christina wrote to her sister Dorothea, "We are as happy and contented as possible." Francesco's health continued to decline. The marriage appears to have been gentle, and the relationship between the young Duchess and her ailing husband was reportedly kind. But the chronic illness that had dogged Francesco for years now accelerated. He fell gravely ill in September 1535, losing the use of most of his limbs. He died on November 2nd, 1535. Christina had been in Milan for less than 18 months. She was 13 years old and a widow. The marriage had produced no children. Later, historical accounts attribute this to Francesco's illness and apparent infertility, rather than to any deliberate prevention. Under the terms of their marriage contract, if Francesco died without heirs, the Duchy of Milan would revert to the Holy Roman Empire, which it duly did. Christina retained only one thing from the marriage: her rights as Lady of Tortona, a small territory in the duchy that she had been granted as part of the marriage settlement, and which she would hold for the rest of her life. She remained in Milan for some months in mourning, her rooms hung with black velvet and black damask. Then she returned north, to Brussels, and to the court of her aunt Mary. Back in the Netherlands, Christina was immediately recognizable as one of the most desirable marriage prospects in Europe. She was young, barely 14. She was beautiful. She was descended from emperors and kings. She had the backing of the most powerful family on the continent. And she was free, in the technical sense that she was no longer attached to anyone. The suitors arrived quickly. The Prince of Piedmont was considered, and then died. The future Charles of Valois was discussed. Other names circulated through diplomatic correspondence. And somewhere in all of this, Christina fell in love, or as close to love as the word permits in this context. His name was René of Chalon, Prince of Orange. He was young, accomplished, chivalrous, and had been a childhood playmate of Christina's brother, John. He was the sole heir of the House of Nassau, and by contemporary accounts he was exactly what a woman might want if she were ever permitted to want anything. Christina and René were drawn to each other openly enough that it was noted at court. He wore her colors in tournaments. He received prizes from her hands. But René was not what Charles V needed. The emperor had larger plans for both of them. In 1540, René was compelled to marry Anne of Lorraine, a match that served the emperor's political purposes. And Charles declared that Christina would be engaged to Anne's brother, Francis of Lorraine. Christina's unofficial courtship ended. René of Chalon died in 1544 at the siege of Saint-Dizier, fighting in one of Charles V's wars, still young, still wearing his motto, "Je maintiendrai," I will maintain. But before any of this, before René, before Lorraine, there was Henry. In October 1537, Henry VIII's third wife, Jane Seymour, died of complications following childbirth. She had given Henry what he had been seeking for decades: a legitimate son, the future Edward VI. But Jane herself did not survive the birth, and Henry was a widower again. He was 46 years old. He was in poor health. A leg wound that had never properly healed caused him chronic pain and had begun to limit his mobility. He was moody, dangerous, and still in search of a wife. By this point, Henry had already moved through 3 queens: Catherine of Aragon, whom he had spent nearly a decade trying to divorce after she failed to produce a surviving male heir; Anne Boleyn, whom he had beheaded in 1536 on charges of adultery and treason, after she too failed to give him the son he wanted; and Jane Seymour, who had given him that son and died in the process. The reputation that had accumulated around him was not subtle. Across Europe, at the courts where potential brides lived and their guardians made decisions, the pattern was clearly visible. Henry began shopping for a 4th wife. Christina of Denmark was on the list. She was young, 16 years old in 1538. She was beautiful. She was a widow with no living children, which meant she was presumably fertile while also being unencumbered by prior offspring. She was a Habsburg, which complicated things slightly, given Henry's break with Rome and his fraught relationship with Charles V. But the potential for a renewed alliance was also attractive, and she was, crucially, reputed to be exceptionally beautiful. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, sent the painter Hans Holbein the Younger to Brussels to capture her likeness. Holbein arrived on March 10, 1538, and arranged a sitting through Benedict, the master of Christina's household. On March 12th, Christina sat for Holbein for exactly 3 hours, from 1 o'clock to 4 in the afternoon. In that time, Holbein made a series of preparatory sketches, drawings of her face, her hands, her posture, her mourning clothes. He then returned to England and, working from those sketches, produced one of the most extraordinary portraits of the entire Tudor era. The painting shows a young woman standing in full length. Unusually, Holbein made this the only full-length female portrait he is known to have completed, against a plain turquoise background. She is dressed entirely in black, a black fur-lined satin gown, a black dress beneath, a black cap over her hair. Her face and hands appear pale against all that darkness. Her lips are red, there is a ring on her finger, and on her face, unmistakably if you look, there is the very faint trace of a smile, as though she already knows what she is about to do. When Henry received a preliminary version of the portrait, he was reportedly overcome with enthusiasm. The imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis recorded that the king was in much better humor than he ever was, making musicians play on their instruments all day long. He sent his proposal. Christina refused. She was 16 years old. She was a woman in a world where women did not refuse kings. She had no army, no throne, no official authority of her own. She had only her aunt's support, her uncle's complicated protection, and her own clear-eyed assessment of what marriage to Henry VIII actually meant. What it meant was not difficult to see. Catherine of Aragon, who was, notably, Christina's own great-aunt, the sister of her mother, Isabella of Austria's mother, had been cast aside after more than 2 decades of marriage because she had not produced a surviving son. Anne Boleyn had been beheaded. Jane Seymour had died. 2 of 3 wives had met their ends through Henry's direct agency or indirect negligence. Christina made no secret of her opposition. She was, contemporary accounts note, forthright in her distaste for the match, and the response she is reported to have given, the words that have echoed down through the centuries since, was addressed to the imperial ambassador. "If I had 2 heads, one should be at the King of England's disposal." The joke, if it can be called that, was precise. It was not hysterical. It was not defiant in the way of someone who has lost their composure. It was the perfectly calibrated remark of a young woman who had looked at a situation and named it exactly for what it was. That, to marry Henry VIII, was to gamble with the only head you had, and she was disinclined to gamble. The remark was also, of course, a calculated insult. It implied that Henry was known across Europe as a man who killed his wives, which he was. It implied that his proposal was not an honor, but a threat. It implied that Christina was aware of precisely what kind of man was asking for her hand, and that her awareness was not softened by flattery, by the prestige of an English crown, or by Henry's evident delight in her portrait. Mary of Hungary was equally unenthusiastic about the match, and for reasons beyond just her niece's welfare. Mary and Christina's mother, Isabella, had both been nieces of Catherine of Aragon. Henry's treatment of Catherine was personal to this family. Mary used her considerable political weight to ensure that the negotiations went nowhere. Henry pushed. He negotiated. He waited. His ambassador in Brussels, Thomas Wriothesley, eventually wrote to Cromwell, advising that the king should simply move on, that it was a lost cause. Henry pursued the match until January 1539. Then he accepted, what had been obvious for months, and turned his attention elsewhere. He eventually settled on Anne of Cleves, a match Cromwell had arranged and which Henry would later deeply regret. He divorced Anne after 6 months. He went on to marry Catherine Howard and had her beheaded. He married, finally, Catherine Parr, who outlived him. Christina's portrait stayed in his possession until he died. After Henry's pursuit ended, Christina's life moved forward. She was still young, barely 17, and still, in the eyes of the world, a piece on the board to be placed. There were more suitors. There was Renee, briefly, impossibly, and then there was Francis. Francis of Lorraine, or Francis Duke of Bar as he was known before inheriting the duchy, was a different kind of man from either of his predecessors in Christina's life. He was not ancient and infirm like Francesco Sforza. He was not Henry VIII. He was young, energetic, and by all accounts, someone Christina could talk to, reason with, build something with. The marriage took place on July 10, 1541, in Brussels. Christina was 19 years old. She traveled to Lorraine with her new husband, settled in the capital at Nancy, and made a life there in a way she had never quite been able to do in Milan. Contemporary descriptions of the marriage suggest something that 16th-century royal marriages rarely achieved: genuine partnership. Francis respected his wife's intelligence. Christina, who had spent her life being moved around Europe like a diplomatic letter, found in Lorraine something she had not had before: a home, and a husband she chose to love. In February 1543, Christina gave birth to a son. They named him Charles. A daughter, Renata, followed in April 1544. Francis had inherited the Duchy of Lorraine the same year, making Christina Duchess in full. The family seemed, for a moment, stable. Francis died in June 1545. He was young, barely 30. Christina was 23 years old, and a widow for the second time, with 2 small children, a posthumously born 3rd child on the way, a daughter named Dorothea, and a duchy that needed governing. When Francis of Lorraine died, he left Christina as regent for their infant son, Charles, who was 2 years old, and now, technically, Duke of Lorraine. The regency was not a ceremonial role. It was a governing one. Lorraine in the 1540s sat in an extraordinarily exposed position between the ambitions of the French crown, the authority of the Holy Roman Empire, and the pressure of local nobles who were not always inclined to accept the authority of a foreign-born widow. Christina governed anyway. The lessons she had absorbed from a childhood spent watching Mary of Hungary now became practice. She managed the competing interests of the duchy. She negotiated carefully between France and the emperor, maintaining the delicate balance that kept Lorraine from being absorbed by either. She handled internal pressure from nobles who questioned whether a woman's hand was steady enough to hold power. She handled external pressure from Henry II of France, who was watching Lorraine with covetous eyes. She governed Lorraine for 7 years. In 1552, the balance finally broke. Henry II of France invaded Lorraine, and letters, intercepted by his agents, appeared to link Christina to the emperor's party. Henry II ordered her to leave. The situation was dangerous enough that she could not safely travel directly to the Netherlands. She took temporary refuge in Schlettstadt until the emperor's army reached the region, then made her way to her sister Dorothea's court in Heidelberg, and from there to Brussels, where she returned at last to her Aunt Mary. She left behind her son Charles, who was taken into French custody. For years, the possibility of reunion was uncertain. She was once again in the position she had spent her entire life navigating. Displaced, without official authority, dependent on relationships and influence rather than formal power. And yet, not entirely without resources. In the years that followed, Christina remained a figure of consequence. There were more marriage proposals from the King of Navarre, from Adolf of Holstein, from the Prince of Piedmont, from Albert of Brandenburg. She declined them all. She had been married twice. She had governed a duchy. She had refused a king. She was not in a position where marriage offered her anything she did not already have. When Mary of Hungary retired in 1555, following Charles V's abdication, the structure that had sheltered Christina for most of her life shifted. But Christina was no longer the girl who had needed shelter. She was a woman in her early 30s with decades of political experience, an extensive network of European connections, and a reputation built on intelligence and durability. In 1559, her father, Christian II, died in his Danish prison, having spent the last 27 years of his life in captivity. That same year, Christina's sister Dorothea, who had no living children, began the process of ceding her claim to the Danish throne in favor of Christina's son. Christina styled herself Christina, by the grace of God, Queen of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. In 1566, she struck a medal bearing that title and the Latin motto, Me sine cuncta runt. Without me, all things fall apart. She was not wrong about her own importance. She spent years pursuing the Danish claim, negotiating with Swedish King Eric XIV about a potential alliance, and attempting to secure the support of the Emperor and the Netherlands for a military campaign to reclaim her father's throne. None of it succeeded. The powers that might have helped her had their own calculations to make, and they did not add up in her favor. The Nordic 7 Years' War, which broke out in 1563 between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, disrupted the plans further. By 1570, when the war ended, Christina had stopped actively pressing the claim, though she never formally renounced it. She was eventually reunited with her son, Charles, who ruled Lorraine with her council, and for whom she again served as regent for a period after her return. She watched him grow into a ruler, marry Claude of Valois, and begin his own dynasty. She had, in the end, done what she had set out to do, preserved the line, the duchy, and the possibility of what came after. Holbein's portrait of Christina hung in Henry VIII's private collection until his death in 1547. It passed through several hands over the following centuries, through the Earl of Pembroke's collection and into the possession of the Dukes of Arundel. In 1880, the 15th Duke placed it on loan to the National Gallery in London. When he later proposed to sell it, the prospect of the painting leaving England caused such public consternation, articles in newspapers, expressions of outrage, that an anonymous donor purchased it for the nation. It hangs there now in the National Gallery, beside Holbein's other masterpieces, The Ambassadors, his portrait of Erasmus, his lady with a squirrel and a starling. You can stand in front of it and see what Henry VIII saw. A 16-year-old girl in black mourning clothes, her face pale against the fur of her collar, her hands quietly clasped, her expression carrying that faint, composed, half-amused trace of a smile. She is younger than you might expect. She looks older than she is. What Holbein captured in 3 hours of sketching on a March afternoon in Brussels was not just a face, but a quality. The particular quality of someone who has assessed a situation and already knows what she's going to do about it. Christina sat for that portrait, knowing it was being commissioned so that a king who had beheaded his last wife could evaluate her as a potential replacement. She sat for it knowing she was going to refuse him. And she sat for it anyway, composed, collected, with that faint trace of a smile that might be amusement or might be something harder and less easily named. In 1578, Christina left Lorraine for good and settled in Tortona, the small Italian territory she had held the rights to since the death of her first husband, Francesco Sforza, 40 years before. It had been waiting for her all that time, a piece of the old life preserved in amber, and she now claimed it fully. She governed Tortona for the last 12 years of her life with the same care and competence she had brought to every other position she had held. She died on December 10th, 1590. She was 69 years old. She had outlived Henry VIII by 43 years. She had outlived 4 of his 6 wives. She had outlived Mary of Hungary, Charles V, Francis of Lorraine, and René of Chalon. She had outlived the men who had arranged her first marriage, the men who had pursued her for Henry, the men who had forced her from Lorraine, and the men who had refused to support her claim to Denmark. She was buried in the Cordelier convent in Lorraine. It would be easy and reductive to reduce Christina of Denmark to the woman who refused Henry VIII. The refusal is the most dramatic single moment in a story that spans nearly 7 decades, and it makes a satisfying narrative beat. The girl in black, the faint smile, the 2 heads. But the refusal is not the whole story. It is not even the most important part of it. The more important part is what came before and what came after. What came before was a childhood, defined by displacement, by a father who lost everything, a mother who died young, a brother who died young, a country she never saw again, an aunt who chose power over marriage and raised her niece to understand why. Christina of Denmark was educated, in the most literal sense, for exactly the world she ended up living in. Margaret of Austria and Mary of Hungary between them transmitted to her something that could not be taught from books. The understanding that women's lives were not simply what men made them, that the margins of the possible were wider than they looked, and that the right word at the right moment, even the right silence at the right moment, could be a form of power. What came after the refusal was a regency, a claim to 3 thrones, the governance of Tortona, and 69 years of a life that was never entirely under anyone else's control. Christina moved within the constraints of her world. Rather than pretending those constraints did not exist, she did not rail against the system openly. She did not refuse marriage as a principle. She married twice, once unwillingly and once with evident happiness. She did not claim that women should rule as a matter of right. She simply, consistently, over the course of a lifetime, found ways to be more than what the situation required her to be. The resistance that defined Christina was not loud, it was not dramatic in the way that stories of resistance are supposed to be dramatic. There was no trial, no escape, no public speech, no visible rebellion. There was just a woman who paid attention, who chose her moments carefully, who said the right thing at the right time, and who, when one of the most powerful and dangerous kings in Europe reached for her expecting the world to arrange itself around his will, looked at him clearly, assessed the situation with the same composed intelligence she brought to everything, and said, no. Not because she had somewhere else to go. Not because she was not afraid, but because she had learned from the women who raised her that survival is not the ceiling of what is possible. Henry VIII kept her portrait until the day he died. He had looked at that face for 9 years and never understood what it was looking back at him. She had 2 heads, she said. If she had a spare, he could have it. She did not have a spare. She kept the one she had for another 52 years, and she used it well.